I just want to start by thanking you all for inviting me out here to talk to you guys. I'm particularly interested in getting some feedback on this talk because I've gotten to a point in this research where I've gotten to the point where I'm not entirely convinced that the original hypothesis was correct. So I'm interested in other people's opinions on how to maybe refine some of my thinking on it. But it is a talk that, in a sense, deals with anorexic behavior and yet, in a sense, does not, because the participants are not women who experience anorexia. They're not a clinical population for the most part. But it's part of an interest in studying how a mechanism that might have evolved in order to have sort of beneficial consequences might be having these kinds of negative consequences in the modern world. So for those who aren't familiar with the sort of anorexic behavior side of things, just a little bit of information about it, because this is sort of where the project originally started when I was a postdoctoral research fellow at Simon Fraser University. The DSM classifies anorexia, or part of its diagnostic criteria for anorexia is when body weight drops below 85% of what's considered normal, regardless of what that might be, for age and height. Also characterized by things like an intense fear of being fat, having a disturbed experience about one's body weight or shape, so body dysmorphia, and then amenorrhea for at least 3 cycles in a row, so the cessation of ovulation typically as well. Historically, those with anorexia nervosa have been disproportionately white, female, upper middle class members of industrial societies. So it's very much been sort of characterized as a disorder of the modern world. And it is more common to see in early maturing girls than late maturing girls in terms of puberty. Often also being characterized by perfectionism and certain characteristics like that. And there's been a lot of research that's been done, and yet not particularly good treatment, I guess, in a sense, for people, which, again, should indicate that we maybe don't understand it quite as well as we might ideally like to. In terms of the number of people that are affected, it's less than 1% actually of females that are in the United States that are affected by anorexia over the lifetime. And that's fulfilling all of those criteria. Now, of course, most of us are probably well aware that a lot more than 1% of women in the population have some of the other concerns that are on that list, things like body dissatisfaction, dieting behavior as well. And so our interest was really in looking at anorexia as sort of an extreme of a continuum of women's concern with body weight and dieting and how that might be reflective of some sorts of ancestral mechanisms. And so just to give you a little bit of an outline of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about some of the common theories concerning dieting behavior and anorexia. I'm going to talk about the reproductive suppression hypothesis for explaining excessive dieting. Talk a little bit about some comparative data that relates to that, so non-human data, actually, that is relevant to that. Some evolutionarily informed studies by people other than me, and then studies that I've done with my colleagues looking specifically at a few different factors that we think have had a role to play, including female-female competition, life history strategy, parental pressure, and then give you some tentative conclusions based on the somewhat unexpected results we got in our last study. So the common theories you guys probably are going to be familiar with because these are the ones you see a lot in the media, but also they're often talked about in psychology classes in general. The idea that social pressure is a major factor in shaping women's concern with being thin and dieting. There's often a lot of pressure attributed to the media in terms of shaping these views, or the idea that males have preferences that are driving women to try and change their physical appearance to satisfy them. There are also ones that involve issues around identity and personal control, and the idea that individuals who feel out of control in terms of some aspects of their lives might choose to try and control their body weight as a way of reasserting themselves. Sometimes this gets articulated as, the idea of having a perfect body as a way of giving their lives meaning and emotional fulfillment. Although the question, of course, of perfect body is a good one to raise in terms of that case, since most people who would be classified as anorexic have certainly created a body that doesn't necessarily fit standard of perfection in terms of the sort of general societal perspective. But it's often described as a way of seizing control that people might be missing in other parts of their lives. It also connected to the psychoanalytic approach, which tends to focus on it in terms of issues of autonomy and control. There's a fair bit of biomedical work looking at whether there could be abnormalities in the endocrine system, whether there might be problems in terms of people's systems for controlling appetite that are not working properly. There's also been some recent work looking at genetic links and looking at familial susceptibility to develop anorexia that are also kind of interesting. But a lot of these are in some ways, very proximate approaches, and they're not necessarily dealing with why these things would matter in the first place, why these would be relevant cues in terms of creating these kinds of problems. And so some of the unanswered questions that originally were the ones that I was sort of preoccupied, I suppose, when I first began this research, included things like, well, what is it about industrialization that is encouraging this particular aspect of female behavior in terms of a thin standard of beauty and dieting? Because it's very clear from the research that this is much more common in industrialized societies than in ones that are non-industrialized. And then also, why do some girls progress then to levels of emaciation that are far thinner than the accepted standard of beauty in the culture? It's one thing to say you have a thin standard of beauty, but that doesn't usually mean the unhealthy degree that you see in cases where it becomes clinical. And so in that sense, it's not exactly the perfect body. And then there's also the question about what environmental variables are likely to drive this and what environmental factors might be preventative. Certainly from the perspective of actually applying it, one might like to know not only what kinds of factors make this kind of excessive dieting more common, but also what kinds of things tend to make it less common, because of course if we're trying to actually prevent it or reduce it, one might want to encourage one of those things and then shape the other in the opposite direction. So a number of different researchers with an adaptationist perspective have looked at this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that some of them done, but first I just want to outline the main hypothesis that's behind most of the work that has been out there. And this is this reproductive suppression hypothesis, which is the idea that natural selection shaped a mechanism for adjusting female reproduction to socio-ecological conditions by altering the amount of body fat. So in a world where you don't have things like birth control pill and all sorts of other types of contraception, one way to influence how likely it is for someone to get pregnant is to influence the amount of body fat that they have, or influence their hormonal levels in a way that is interfering with ovulation. And then this suggestion in terms of how this might apply to humans in particular, and why this might be something that we would see more in the modern environment, has to do with the fact that the cues that might have signaled the need for a temporary postponing, temporarily undesirable conditions for actually reproducing, may be experienced to a greater degree in the modern environment. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, because some of the work that we've done suggests we may not actually have a good grasp on what those conditions might be, because some of the ones we thought they would be are not really turning out to be the ones that are showing up that way in the data. But the original suggestion was that this would result in fears related to things like fatness and body image that would drive women in conditions unfavorable to reproduction to reduce their body weight to an extent where they would not actually be ovulating. And so it's based really on these two different concepts: adaptive reproductive suppression, right, which is just the idea that because reproduction is costly for mammals, that females facing poor conditions might be better off to postpone and reproduce later when they'll be more likely to be more successful and to have the resources, for example, the food resources, to successfully raise those offspring. And there are a number of studies that have documented this in other species, other non-human species, including some other primates, rhesus monkeys and baboons, and in a number of other mammals, including wolves, foxes, some antelope, typically in subordinate females, where you're seeing a situation where subordinate females in those populations are suppressing ovulation. Now, whether they're self-suppressing it or whether the suppression is imposed by dominant females is a question that in some species has been determined and in others it hasn't. But it's based on that and based on this critical fat hypothesis, which is that you need a certain amount of body fat in order for ovulation to occur.
Can I ask a quick question? Is that in these other mammal species, is that accompanied by weight loss when they have reproductive suppression?
Not necessarily. So in some of them it may be, but in some of them it's clearly what's being measured is hormonal changes that are driving it. Yeah. And it's not clear in humans whether it's the drop in weight or the effect of the drop in weight on hormones that's driving it in humans too, right? Because it may be just that if you're changing, there's two possibilities. One is if you're changing the fat and that's influencing levels of estrogen, that could be part of what's involved. But it could also be just stress hormones playing a role. And so that's not entirely clear from any of the stuff that I've seen or our own work. Again, so there's this aspect that you need a certain amount of body fat in order to ovulate. And again, it's not that there's like one level, like you have to have this amount, but it's that if that is consistent between every individual person. But that if you do drop below a certain point within an individual, then ovulation ceases. And you see this a lot in extreme athletes. If you look at gymnasts, for example, many of them fail. They have primary amenorrhea. They fail to actually start their menstrual cycles and fail to start ovulating due to high levels of training. But there are also a number of cases where they may have started and then the level of training causes it to stop. And you see this in female bodybuilders as well. So the main point is really about delaying reproduction adaptively if conditions are likely to be better in the future, right? That's the adaptive aspect of it. It's supposed to be, well, if conditions will improve, you should wait until conditions improve. And so the suggestion has been that in the modern world, the cues that it may be a bad time to reproduce may be a little bit exaggerated, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Just to highlight some of the comparative examples, and because I like pictures of cute little animals, I have just a few examples of other species where reproductive suppression has been studied, including cooperatively breeding meerkats, which show evidence for a role of elevated stress hormones in their reproductive suppression. And it looks like it's mostly imposed by the dominant females, that they act aggressively towards the subordinate females, causing higher levels of stress hormones and then suppressing their reproduction in order for the subordinates to help them raise their offspring and not interfere with the dominants having more offspring of their own. As well, something similar seems to be happening in Mongolian gerbils, which is the other little guy at the top. Young female gerbils seem to also be experiencing suppression when they are living with older members of their own natal family. So typically it's suppressed if they stay in environments where the parents are. And so it looks like, again, you're seeing a situation where there's a lot of alloparental care happening. And if there aren't the resources for young to go out and breed on their own, they're suppressing ovulations, suppressing reproduction in order to care for their genetic relatives. And then the little guy at the bottom, which I think is cute, but not everybody thinks they're so cute, is a little mole rat. And mole rats as well seem to have forms of reproductive suppression that are going on. They also often are alloparental care species. And there were actually some studies looking at this in particular in the Maryland mole rats, where they were looking at this issue about whether or not it's self-suppression versus dominant suppressing the the subordinates. And in this particular case, they came to the conclusion based on looking at the behavior of the dominants and looking at whether or not there were any indications that there was any kind of pheromonal sort of mechanism that could be influencing it, came to the conclusion that it seemed like it was self-suppression that was happening in the case of the mole rats in terms of them delaying reproduction in order to care for their genetic relatives. So what is it about this modern environment that might be creating something that almost seems more than just the suppression of ovulation, because it goes to such an extreme extent sometimes in the human case? And so this question about whether if it functioned adaptively in the past, whether it would be functioning adaptively today. One of the things is that from at least some people's perspectives, the social and ecological cues that might have signaled a need for temporary postponement of reproduction might be experienced to an unprecedented intensity and duration in the modern world because of the way that our social structure has tended to develop in urban centers, for example. So that if you think about the kind of environment that many humans would have lived in, they would have been smaller face-to-face groups, not the 1,000+ high schools that young men and women go to in a lot of industrialized countries today. And if some of the cues of things that might have been considered cues of, okay, maybe it's not a good time to reproduce, include things like really high levels of competition between women, competition for mates, for example, or stressful sexual attention from males that might not be considered good choices for mates, that these kinds of situations might be more commonly experienced now in the modern environment than they might have ever been historically in the past, in the sense that, again, you have many, many, many more young women that are all competing for mates at the same time. And because of the decreasing age of puberty in many industrialized countries, young girls are also experiencing attention from all sorts of males and these sort of exacerbated levels of competition from a very young age, and then often delaying marriage so that these same pressures are often sort of extending over a longer period of time as well. And so there may be a number of features of the modern environment that make this maybe not function as adaptively as we might have thought it might. Another factor that we were interested in looking at was also the function of social support, knowing that high levels of social support are very helpful, whether they're from family, other kin, husbands or partners, or friends, that these things are important to successfully raising offspring for humans. How much does social support or perceived levels of social support influence the likelihood of developing excessive dieting behavior? And so we were really interested in looking at how these features of the modern environment might play into exacerbating or developing extensive or higher levels of eating disordered behavior. So some of the advantages of the model, just in terms of why we were interested in looking at it from this perspective, is because it provides this link between industrialization and dieting. Also because it fits well with what we know about sex differences in body image preferences, that women prefer a thinner standard of beauty in industrialized countries than men do. So if you ask men about what they find most attractive, the body image that they prefer is not as thin as the body image that most women will prefer in those populations. And then it allows for the integration of a number of different psychological variables that we either think might be relevant or that other people have suggested are relevant, including things like need for achievement, status striving, competition being stressful for women, the roles of social support and perception of that, social competition, things like that. And so what I'm going to talk about, I just briefly wanted to mention some of the early evolutionary approaches, and then I'm going to cover some of the studies in particular that I've been involved with. Because again, I think some of these earlier studies point out or illustrate why we chose certain factors in our own model. So some early evolutionary approaches that you see, Judith Anderson and Charles Crawford did a number of studies in the 90s looking at the possibility that reproductive suppression could be one way that adolescents, that reproductive suppression could be one way that adolescents manage certain kinds of environments. And so they engaged in 2 studies that I think were particularly interesting. One that was looking at actually modeling the conditions under which adolescent suppression of reproduction would lead to fitness benefits. And then the other one was a cross-cultural study looking at dieting behavior and standards of beauty cross-culturally, documenting, again, the link between industrialization and a thin standard of beauty, pointing out that if you look at societies where women's economic value is within the home, you tend to find heavier standards of beauty. Whereas if you look at societies where women's economic power is outside the home, you tend to find a thinner standard of beauty. Also, there are sort of 2 and a half other studies or approaches that were relevant. One is Abed's work on intersexual competition in eating disorders, really focusing on female-female competition and the idea that it's competition for mates that's driving reproductive suppression. And they predicted a role basically for that and documented it using a number of different scales, that there was a relationship between perception of intersexual competition or engaging in more competitive behavior were both linked to higher levels or higher scores on eating disorder scales. Again, most of the studies weren't looking at clinical populations. And then also, I was also at the time very influenced by Linda Mealy's work, where she was suggesting actually not so much this role of self-suppression, but looking at this issue around dominant females suppressing the reproduction of subordinate females, that this was a tactic that women were using against other women. Because that fits well with some of the animal literature. Unfortunately, there's not been very much research actually done trying to test that kind of model, the self-suppression versus dominant suppression of subordinates in humans. Although there have been a couple studies that have looked at the behavior of women who score high in intersexual competition and who also themselves are engaging in a lot of dieting behavior, also tend to be more likely to pressure other women about their weight. So they seem to be engaging in behavior trying to encourage that same behavior in other women. So it might be supportive of that, but still not very clear. So the rest of the work that I'm going to talk about are a number of different studies that I've been involved in. The first group of them are ones mainly focusing on the role of female-female competition, and then also testing a few other factors in terms of things that would increase the likelihood of disordered eating behavior. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some studies, 2 studies that I've done that were modeling a variety of different factors, both on the predictive level in terms of increasing the likelihood, but also a number of protective factors that we think reduce the likelihood, or we thought should reduce the likelihood. So the predictions that I originally went into this sort of using this kind of model included this idea that the perceived level of female-female competition would impact young women's eating disorder inventory scores. That's one of the clinical measures for diagnosing eating disorders, with higher levels of competition producing higher scores. That stressful male attention would also produce higher eating disorder inventory scores, and I'll talk a little bit what we meant by stressful male attention in a minute. The greater fashion content, so being exposed to more images of very attractive women in media products would also produce higher scores, and that increased levels of stress from non-reproductive sources, and so thinking about some of these things as being more reproductively minded, like the female competition and the male attention. Non-reproductive sources would not produce the significant effects on EDI scores as the stress from the reproductive concerns. That pre-existing susceptibility to eating disorders actually exists. Some of that might be biological, some of it might have to do with family environment, but that pre-existing susceptibility will make some women more prone than others to develop anorexic-like behavior when exposed to the same kinds of factors that we think do increase the likelihood. The perceptions of high levels of social support will make people less susceptible. And also that viewing attractive women will increase EDI scores regardless of whether they're presented in a sexualized way or a non-sexualized way. And that was, again, just looking at, and it was a study that was designed to look, again, at sort of the effect of exposure to media images on disordered eating behavior. So what I'm really talking about here is sort of this particular section, there's 7 different studies. The first 5 had the exact same methodology. We had what we considered a susceptibility score, which had to do with things like ineffectiveness, interoceptive awareness, really in a sense kind of a proxy in some ways for emotional intelligence is kind of what we were looking at. And then what we were using as dependent measures in terms of disordered behavior, body dissatisfaction, the things that are on the EDI for drive for thinness, and maturity fears about being ready to take on adult responsibilities, parenting responsibilities, things like that. All 7 of the studies that I'm going to talk about involve undergraduate students, and I'll talk a little bit about how we would like to do some studies not using those in the future, but certainly for the ones we've done in the past, they've all been undergraduate students. Some of them were undergraduate students in Canada. Some of them are undergraduate students from California and Arizona. In the first 5 studies, they completed questionnaires that had them read scenarios that involved different kinds of situations involving levels of female competition that were either high or low, aspects of male attention where the men were considered desirable or undesirable. And again, varying their levels of exposure to these different tasks or situations. And then, so they were first given the measure of susceptibility. They were then exposed to the questionnaire, or exposed to the scenarios, and then they completed the dependent measure of the EDI. So it was just looking at their scores after that. And one of the reasons for choosing the EDI is that it's been used a lot. And so there's really good standardized information about what clinical populations look like and what comparison ordinary college populations that are not diagnosed look like. So we could sort of situate our data in that kind of context. And so the different types of stressors or stresses included female-female competition, male attention, media or fashion content in terms of exposure to magazines, a situation where they had a music exam to prepare for, that they were either prepared for or that they were not prepared for. A gardening scenario where the parents were away and they were responsible for taking care of the garden, and they were not well equipped to do this or did not have the time to do it, and then a situation where they actually enjoyed it and had lots of time to work on it. And a situation where they were waiting to hear about information about a friend who was in the hospital, who either had a severe injury or a mild injury in terms of the stress level. And there were about 100 participants in each of the studies. And so I'm just going to give you a quick run through the results. This presents the data from the female-female competition scenario and the male attention scenario, and it's showing the high versus low stress situations. So you can see, not surprisingly, that the higher stress situations, at least from our perspective, produced higher levels or higher scores on the EDI subscales. What's kind of interesting is that even the low stress male attention seemed to create more of an issue. And so in fact, you get a much bigger effect for the female competition one than you do for the male attention, but it does seem to be driven by the fact that all male attention to a certain extent seems to be creating some effect here. If you're interested in like college norms, if you're just giving people in general the EDI for these subscales, it's about 20. So the high stress conditions, they were exhibiting a higher level than you would just see in a random population, giving it to them with no stimulation at all or no scenario at all. And that was true for all of our high stress ones. Yep.
Can I ask one clarifying question?
Yep.
So the EDI, is it measuring sort of a more chronic kind of behavioral state, or is it asking questions about like right now, do you want to eat 16 Twinkies?
It doesn't necessarily things like ask you about right now. So just as an example of some of the questions so you have an idea. So things like the subscale for drive for thinness asks things like questions like, I am preoccupied with the desire to be thinner. So it's asking about a more generalized state in that sense. Body satisfaction, it's things like, on this scale of 1 to whatever, how satisfied are you with your body? Maturity fears, it's things like, well, the happiest time in life is when you're a child. So they're those kinds of questions. So they're not necessarily targeted specifically at in this moment in time, how do you feel about this? It's more of a general thing. So in the sense, is it chronic?
Well, no, that
Yeah.
answers my question.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so this was sort of the result that we saw for this. Oops. And that was, go away.
Yeah, it's not a touchscreen.
Oh. So what do I do to make it go away? If it's not a touchscreen, don't disturb me? Or,
The escape button.
which is, oh, that's a good idea. Let's try that. Yep, that worked fine. Not quite used to the Mac. Okay, so those were the two that we were paying the most, that we had sort of the most interest in a sense, as seeing them as the reproductive type stressors as far as the model was concerned. But we looked at the others, and so what was also interesting is the other ones all seem to be producing higher levels as well, right? So the media one, the fashion content produced higher scores than the non-fashion content. The stressful gardening situation, music situation, hospital, all created significantly higher levels than the other ones. So, I mean, one of the sort of takeaways was that we felt was that it was actually kind of disturbingly easy to mess with people's scores on the eating disorders inventory. So we wondered, actually at the time, and I still wonder, whether it's not actually a more generalized response to stress than we actually were thinking. Because we were thinking, well, there's these very specific stressors that may be having an effect. But it does look, at least to us, that all of these things are having some effect. Now, we did look at the actual effect sizes afterwards as well. And the biggest effect size was for the female-female competition one. That the low to high stress was making the biggest difference in that case. But it was followed by the music one. So again, I'm not quite sure what was going on. And the smallest effect was actually for the media study, which was kind of interesting. Although since then, there was a meta-analysis that came out that was looking at the effects of media exposure on dieting behavior. This is just showing all of them together, split by susceptibility. Anyways, this meta-analysis that was looking at effects of media it suggested that the media exposure was only responsible for about 5% of the variance in terms of people's body dissatisfaction. So it didn't look like it was having as big an effect as people thought. This was just the way that the results looked in terms of trying to assess what's going on with susceptibility. Now, this does not, we chose to split the sample on the things that we thought were relevant to susceptibility with a median split just into high and low. And the high susceptibility ones were higher than the low susceptibility. They seemed more vulnerable to the manipulation. But it still didn't assess what the specific things were that were causing susceptibility. And that's something that I guess in a sense we've looked at more in some of the future studies. And because this is one of the things that we think is relevant in terms of future studies, I want to talk about one study that was done by a student in the lab where I was a postdoc, where she used the same dependent measures as we've been using in these other studies. But she was mainly interested in the role of social support on disordered eating behavior. And she was looking in particular at how much the support from romantic partners mattered, how much the support from friends mattered, and how much the support from family mattered as predictors. And then she was using the same dependent measures as we did, the maturity fears, body dissatisfaction, and drive for thinness. And in her case, what was important in predicting the EDI scores was how long they'd been in a relationship with the person that they were currently having sex with, and whether they perceived themselves as having lots of social support from their partner and from their family What wasn't relevant was actually the social support from their friends. Now, whether that's an artifact of them being college students and those friendships being short friendships at that point, because maybe we had a lot of freshmen, I don't know. But certainly that sense of feeling like you're in a relationship that you can count on and your family and your partners are supportive produced lower eating disordered behavior and more parental readiness on the parental readiness scale that they gave as well. They felt more capable of taking care of a child if, in fact, they actually had one. So that's, again, sort of suggestive that, and this is just going over some points related to that this perception of support from family and from sexual partners seemed to have a protective effect against developing eating disordered behavior. And in the study that I'm going to show you at the end, we looked at it from the flip side, how much those individuals can pressure you in ways that might actually increase your eating disordered scores. But generally, that was one of the other things, is that we found that in general, people that scored high in terms of their disordered eating also scored very low on their parental readiness scores. So again, sort of just highlighting this possible link to the reproductive aspects of things. Now, the other study that sort of belongs in this earlier cluster with this general type of methodology is one that was trying to assess, again, this role of sexualization in the media and how much that might or might not play a role. So in this particular study, there was a questionnaire that students got that asked questions about social support. But they were told, they were recruited to be part of a memory study, and so they were shown a number of photos as part of the study that they then had to answer questions about at the end. And some of them looked at photos that showed Victoria's Secret models in very little clothing. And some actually included the same models, but wearing, like a suit, right? And so they had that particular sort of set of conditions where the woman was presented in a very sexualized way, one where she was presented in a very, well, at least a somewhat non-sexualized way. And then there was another condition where we went in and we interfered with her attractiveness. So we used Photoshop to add cellulite to her legs and abdomen, and we slightly changed the symmetry of her facial features to make her less attractive. And so we were looking again at the issue of the attractiveness and then the sexuality, sexualization aspect. Anyway, so the takeaway from that is that what mattered more was how attractive she was as opposed to how sexual the image was. So seeing women in lingerie wasn't so much the issue, it was just seeing really beautiful women, regardless of what they were wearing, seemed to have an effect in terms of their EDI scores. And in this case, it was total EDI scores, not just the subscale scores. So just as a quick summary of those initial results from those initial studies, we found that female-female competition had the greatest impact, but all of the high stress did seem to increase people's EDI scores, which again, sort of for us raised the question about whether all stress tends to contribute to this, and maybe if levels of stress are high, then maybe it's not a good time to reproduce regardless of where those stresses are coming from. Certainly susceptibility seemed to be playing a role, although we're still not clear what factors go into that. Social support may be very important in terms of preventative aspects of things, and beauty seemed to be more relevant than the sex objects per se aspect of things in terms of the media kind of effects. And so I want to talk about a little bit more about female intrasexual competition, because again, that was a very important part of this final model, although it didn't turn out to be quite as important as we thought. But I want to talk a little bit about that, and I want to talk a little bit about life history strategy, which is what we incorporated into this final model that I'm going to talk about. And so I already mentioned one of these studies previously, and sort of Abbott's work on the sexual competition hypothesis, and the idea that female intrasexual competition for mates as an underlying cause of eating disorders or disordered eating behavior, but also a study that was done that was also testing that hypothesis that was done by A.J. Figueredo and colleagues, where they added intrasexual competition for status as well to that kind of model. So they were looking at whether that might be driving, in their particular case, they were looking to see whether they thought, because they were trying to test whether they thought that competition for mates was driving bulimic behaviors more than status, which was influencing anorexia more in their model. And so what this really got me thinking about and got me working with A.J. Figueredo on some of this was looking again at this issue that maybe female-female competition is the really, for mates, is really the big thing that's driving all of this, especially in light of some of those earlier studies showing the female competition had a bigger effect size. But the other thing that we were thinking about putting in here and that we put into the model that I'm going to talk about that we tested is life history strategy. And I don't think I need to go over this a lot for this audience, but just, again, just the idea that life history strategy is just a way of describing the strategic allocation of resources amongst different components of fitness, with one end being somatic effort and the other end being reproductive effort. And this has often been sort of conceptualized as being on a fast-slow continuum, right, where fast life history strategy has to do with rapid sexual development. You've got to have high fertility, not a lot of parental care, and relatively short lifespans. Where case selected, which often has been used to characterize humans in general, although there clearly is variation within humans, as being slower development, slower reproduction, longer lifespan, a lot of investment in individual offspring. And so we were really focusing on the role of what we considered slow life history strategy, and the idea that under this circumstance, there might be certain factors that are very beneficial to following a slow life history strategy that also might play a role in being protective against eating disordered behavior, partially because of the likelihood of slow life history strategy being associated with lower levels of competition, right, for mates, that you're, in a sense, not being as competitive over quick mating effort as someone who would be engaging in a fast life history strategy. And one of the things that other studies have shown is correlated with slow life history strategy is self-control or executive function. And that's also kind of interesting because in the history of research and studies talking about eating disorders, that's also something that's been brought up, right, is that issues about self-control are considered relevant. And so when we think about executive functions, we're really talking about a set of cognitive abilities that regulate our abilities and behaviors. So being able to sort of monitor your behavior, being able to plan for the future, really the kinds of things that we think about when we think about self-regulation or self-control. And again, some previous studies have suggested that there's a positive correlation between K-factor, slow life history, and higher levels of executive functions. And so what we did was to incorporate this into a model looking at female competition and eating disordered behavior. And so we had a question. So again, this was a study that was using female undergraduates. And as you can see, there were a number of different measures that the students completed that were part of the survey, including a measure of intrasexual competition, measure of slow life history strategy, executive functions. Also, were given the eating disorders inventory, and they were also given a measure to assess socially desirable responding. And the results that I'll present will have controlled for that in the analysis. Again, these were studies. This was a study done with students from California and Arizona. And we tested two different models. One was a model where executive function has an indirect effect on disordered eating because of its effect on reducing levels of female competition. And then in the second model, it had a direct effect on it. And so I'm just going to, so the predictions were that slow life history would have an effect on executive function, as other studies have shown, that those executive functions would have an effect on competition for mates, would serve to lower it. And we already know from some other work that A.J. Figueredo's colleagues have done that competition for mates seems to be related to competition for status, in the sense that it seems like it's the competition for mates that's driving the competition for status. And then we thought that the competition for status would then have a direct effect on eating disorders. So there was one that was a very linear model and one that was not. And so when we looked at the linear model, you can see, in fact, it was actually not a good fit. Because while those initial predictions about the relationship between slow life history and executive function and competition for mates, and competition for mates and competition for status held true, there was not this relationship between competition for status and eating disorders. There did not seem to be any predictive power there for that. But when we tested the other model, we did get a good fit. And in this case, slow life history was predictive of executive functions. Having slow life history produced higher levels of executive functions, which directly influenced eating disorders in a negative way. Having high self-control actually reduced the likelihood of disordered eating behavior, in contrast to a lot of the theories that have been suggested about that. And then again, executive function was also having an impact on competition for mates, lowering that, which then again had the expected relationship between competition for mates and competition for status. So what it looks like is that it's executive functions that's driving this. What's interesting is it's suggesting that there isn't a direct relationship between the competition for mates and the eating disorders. And that's the part that I'm still not quite sure what's going on with, because it seems to me, in a sense, kind of odd. But certainly in this model and in the other one that I'm going to show you that has a lot more factors in, and unfortunately is a lot more complicated and messy looking, it does not look like there is a direct relationship anyways between the competition for mates and the higher levels of eating disordered behavior. It seems like executive functions is having a much larger role to play in that.
Catherine, before you
Yeah.
just to make sure, so this is a subclinical student population?
Yes, it is. Yes, yeah. No. So, and that's one of the things I'm going to talk about at the end. We would like to actually do this in looking at a clinical population and looking at an older population, not just an undergraduate one.
Another very quick one.
Yeah.
And I apologize if you already went over this, but the eating disorders category, that includes subclinical levels of a number of eating disordered behaviors.
Right. So we're using the EDI as our measure of disordered eating behavior. And in terms of our particular samples, typically what we've seen when we actually just look at the scores to look at how our sample compares to standardized data on the EDI, for most of the measures are, what I would say is the average for our undergraduates is lower than the clinical level. But in some cases, it's certainly higher than what they consider the comparison normal population level.
And this isn't just anorexia, like self-starving type behavior. It's also bulimic type, like binge eating and things like this are measured?
So the measures that we're using, the subscales that we're using, are things like drive for thinness, maturity fears, body dissatisfaction. In this particular study, we did not use the bulimia subscale in it.
That's good.
So,
I
yeah.
was just wondering whether if you had binned them separately, you might have seen a different result, but evidently.
Yeah, we did do, I was not part of this particular study, but AJ with one of his students and Abed did do a study where they were looking at a clinical population and they did include those measures in it. And that was one of the ones that led to them thinking that the status versus mating was different because they found that one loaded on one of those things more than the other. But then in this model, it doesn't look like it's working that way. So we're still, I think that's still quite an open question as to what's going on with that. But yeah. Okay. So anyways, in terms of this one, you can see that looks, again, like I said before, that executive functions is playing a bigger role. And just to summarize that, we found direct relationships between slow life history and executive functions that were positive. Executive functions and competition for mates, which was negative, and then competition for mates and competition for status, which actually was positive, not negative. Just a typo there. And then also found this direct relationship between executive functions and disordered eating behavior, which was sort of preventative kind of effect, where it was suppressing those kinds of effects, or it was resulting in lower levels, which, again, is part of the puzzle for me, in a sense, in terms of my own thinking about how our data fits in with the reproductive suppression model in terms of the issue about female competition not playing as big a role as we thought. The other thing, just in terms of the other model that I want to show you from this other study, was one where we were adding the issue about social support in a sense, except we were doing the flip. We were looking at it in terms of looking at parental pressure as opposed to parental support. So it was parental and peer pressure. And adding it into the life history model. And so we actually had very similar predictions as we did before, but we had this additional aspect that higher parental and peer pressure would positively predict disordered eating behavior if more supportive parents and peers tend to sort of reduce it. And so we were arguing that slower life history strategy and higher emotional intelligence and higher executive function would predict also lower impulsivity, which would then impulsivity would predict higher eating disorder scores. So again, this is coming back to this issue around self-control and regulation. And in this study, we have a few more participants, although not nearly as many as we were hoping, because we had 280 students do it and 188 complete sets of data. But again, certainly it's an undergraduate population that we were looking at as well here. And these students were given this list. It was quite a long survey for them. But there were a number of items here that are additional to the previous model. So things like looking at emotional intelligence, looking at impulsivity as well. And then we also had a measure of their past eating behavior, their past eating. So it's sort of like the idea that there's a pattern for some of them in terms of disordered eating. So looking at a history of that. And then this addition of the parental and peer pressure scales. And then we'd also ask some questions about their psychological and physical health. Just in a preliminary, before we even looked at the structural equation model, we did find that parental pressure from mother and father were actually, they were both equally correlated with eating disorder behavior. So there was clearly a relationship with experiencing more parental pressure and higher levels of disordered eating. And it didn't seem to matter whether it was the mother or the father. The levels were pretty much the same. In terms of the equation model, this is never my favorite part of stuff because it just gets complicated. But this is the goodness of fit data on the model that I'll show you in a minute, which is really an ugly, messy model, but it did have a good fit in terms of things. But here's the big, messy model that has everything sort of banged into it. But what you can see is that if you look at the relationship between the slow life history strategy and the other variables, it's having a direct effect, as it did in the other study, on the disordered eating behavior. But it's also having indirect effects through its effect on executive control or behavioral regulation, which has a direct effect on disordered eating. It's also having an effect because of its influence on things like emotional intelligence, which is also having a direct negative effect on disordered eating. The other things that have direct effects on disordered eating in the model are having a history of disordered eating behavior, which is not surprising. And then also parental and peer pressure is having a direct effect as well. And it's an effect that's positive. So it's positive, but that really has a negative connotation to it. So it's positive in the sense that higher levels of pressure are resulting in more eating disordered behavior. But part of the effect of slow life history strategy and executive function is being moderated by its effect on impulsivity and impulsive behavior, which also has a role to play in parental and peer pressure. So some of what's going on, or at least it looks like maybe some of what's going on, is also if you have individuals, daughters in this case, that are more impulsive and that you're more concerned about their behavior, the parents are exerting more pressure on them. And so that might be one of the susceptibility factors that we were looking at, right? It may be that individuals who have more impulsive behavior or more impulsive predispositions are causing parents to exert more pressure on them, and that is resulting in some of this increased disordered eating behavior. And again, you can see when you look at the intrasexual competition down at the bottom, it's not having a direct effect on the disordered eating behavior. It is having an effect on, some of the other things. Well, actually, it's not really that it's having an effect on the other things. Other things that affect disordered eating are also affecting it. So the emotional intelligence is affecting it. Impulsivity is affecting it. Parental and peer pressure is affecting it. So it looks like, in a sense, the things that affect disordered eating also affect intersexual competition or your perception of it. And that's why they look, at least to us in most of the studies that we'd done, we weren't controlling for those things or factoring those things in, looked like it was influencing it because they're actually both being influenced by the same causal factors, which still sort of leaves me in a place where I'm not quite sure how to explain that aspect of the reproductive suppression model. So just some overall conclusions: that female intrasexual competitiveness was directly linked to low emotional intelligence and high impulsivity. That disordered eating behaviors were directly linked to things like low emotional intelligence, low executive function, and faster life history strategy, as well as a prior history of eating pattern problems and high levels of aggregate parental and peer pressure. Some of the continuing work as try to figure out what's actually going on in terms of the model. One is to look at this in a non-college student sample, not necessarily a clinical sample, but definitely a non-college student sample. And also to maybe look at it in a non-Western sample, because again, some of what we could be seeing could be unique to the particular kinds of college populations that we've been looking at in terms of the amount of variability that we're actually getting in, for example, things like life history strategy. And then further examination of the issue of what actually is determining things like susceptibility, and maybe taking another step back and looking at some of the biological data on genetic differences between people who are more likely to develop it versus not in terms of the familial work. And then I'd just like to acknowledge the many colleagues that I've worked on this with, AJ Figueredo and a number of the students that have worked in his lab, and Charles Crawford and Laura Dane from Simon Fraser University, and some of the students that have been there as well. And I'm happy to take any questions. Adam, yep, go ahead.
Interesting talk, thank you. So, the reproductive suppression hypothesis is basically that a young woman finds herself in a stressful situation and it's adaptive to delay reproduction under those circumstances.
Bad breeding circumstances mean wait until they'll get better. Now that also is contingent on the idea that they will get better, right? In some environments they won't, right? And that could certainly play a role too, and that's partially, I think, has been the thinking of people who suggested that, well, you don't see this kind of reproductive suppression in some very poor environments, right? I mean, there's some really poor environments where there's high fertility. But if those really poor environments are ones where it's always going to be really poor, then there's no benefit to waiting. Whereas in many Western environments, there might be real advantages to waiting.
Especially with college samples, these are people who are expecting to delay reproduction.
Exactly.
Who are educating themselves well into adulthood.
Yes.
But I mean, also so experimentally you might try to control what people's expectations of the future are, or at least survey them, and that might help clean up some of these things.
Or at least look for more variability in that.
But then generally, I mean, the connection between slow life history reducing the chances of the disordered eating. I mean, if the disordered eating is a tactic of delaying reproduction.
I know, it doesn't fit. I know, it doesn't fit. And that's the puzzle for us, right? Is that we got this back and I'm looking at this and I'm like, oh, that's not what I was expecting to see, right? Now, it may be that, that people who are already following a slow life history strategy, they're not running into those problems because they already are perceiving, see, from my perspective, I was thinking, well, they're already having a more sensible approach to female-female competition and things like that, and so they're not getting themselves into that situation. I'm not sure now, based on some of the results, that that's necessarily what's going on. But yeah, my prediction was I was expecting to see slow life history strategy being associated with the suppression of reproduction. And that's not what we saw. And so that is part of the puzzle for me in terms of my thinking about where the problem lies, whether it's in our conception of the role of life history strategy in it, whether it's in the conception of the suppression model itself, or with how it's functioning in this kind of an environment. And I don't know. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
Thank you for this interesting talk. I just had a quick question about whether you, like your thoughts about using a non-clinical sample, and I was wondering if the purpose is to look at the full spectrum of a particular trait, like body image or dieting behavior, in order to understand the tail end of that spectrum, or is are you actually like endeavoring to use these extreme aspects of the spectrum in order to understand this trait itself, even when it may be functional or neutral or adaptive?
Yeah, I mean, I think the original interest in the project was in the puzzles about what drives anorexia to that extent. But I think in terms of, my thinking about the suppression model, it's in trying to understand the variability in dieting and how substantial it is, because you don't have to go to the point of what most anorexics are like to have reproductive suppression. Most gymnasts would not necessarily be considered to be unhealthy in that sense, but they certainly are engaging in that behavior. And it may be that you don't need to, in order to have adaptive reproductive suppression, you don't have to have that extreme. And so I'm kind of interested, I suppose, myself personally, in how much the model might work in an adaptive sense, where I would view the anorexic extreme as the maladaptive outcome of it in the modern world, maybe. Yes?
So I have three only partially related comments, questions. First, picking up on this clinical versus subclinical population, I'm not an expert in this by any means, but it's my impression that the personality characteristics of people who suffer from clinical restrictive anorexia nervosa are that they are hyper self-control. In other words, they have very strong executive function in that it takes a great deal of self-restraint to, that is when they're at normal body weight. When they're grossly underweight, they exhibit impulse control disorders, but that's, I have a story about that. That's an adaptive mechanism responding to food shortage. Yeah,
and I've seen some stuff on that too. One of the things that I think, the way I think about that is kind of analogous in some ways to thinking about, somebody who's an alcoholic. It's like they don't have the self-regulation to actually have one drink, in a sense, and then just leave it, right? So they either have to do nothing or drink too much. And I kind of tend to think about it as maybe being something similar to that in terms of how the self-control thing may play into it, right? That if you that people who have high executive function, as we were measuring it, they can manage just fine to regulate without going to that extreme, and that you only see the extreme when in fact there is some difficulty in that. I'm not sure that is entirely, true. That's just my perception based on the kind of data that we've seen. But I agree that certainly that has been the traditional perspective of what's going on with eating disorders, has been that it is an excessive amount of self-control.
So I have a maybe a broader concern, which is that, and it's always easy for spectators as we are to sit and say, oh well, you should have measured this, you should have measured that, but I mean there's a paper, I haven't read it yet, I just glanced at the abstract in the latest issue of EHB that shows a negative correlation between slow life history and psychopathology in general, across a range of psychopathologies. So it's not unique to eating disorders. And similarly, I would imagine that you would find negative correlation between social support or positive correlation between competition and pressure, and a range of potentially pathological behaviors.
Yeah.
So my concern is that when you're focusing on restrictive eating
Sure,
by itself,
right,
you might be getting
Sure.
interesting correlations, but they might in fact just be tips of icebergs of things that are theoretically incompatible with, certainly with the reproductive suppression.
right. It could be just that all of these things are associated with pathological behavior in general, or at least many of these things. And I think that that certainly could be true to a certain extent. It's kind of one of the reasons that I mentioned earlier, we wondered when we did the first set of studies whether this was just some sort of generalized stress response, right? That it's like if there's negative, stressful things in the environment, it shuts down stuff, including ovulation. And it's not necessarily specific to the kinds of things that we think are important to the reproductive suppression model. And that's possible. I agree. It could be part of it. Yep.
Well, this partly follows up on
Mhm.
Dan's question. Well, okay, so first a question about the empiric. So has anyone done any studies where they've looked, like used social network analysis, especially longitudinally, to see how eating disorders spread through, one person has it and then their friend is more likely to have it? And
I actually haven't seen that. I've only seen that done in studies that have looked at familial stuff as opposed to friendship social networks.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
There may be something out there, but I haven't seen it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because it occurs to me that one possible, it's sort of related to what Dan said, causal link is between having low executive function and being susceptible to bizarre ideas and practices of all sorts. So, self-mutilation. Or for that matter, there are suicide cults, and
Sure.
there actually have been for a long time.
Well, there's all that Slender Man stuff with the kids going out
Yeah.
and
And so that,
violence.
so you've got low executive function, susceptibility to
Low executive function is generally not good for it. Yeah. It's
so
gonna,
that whatever bizarre ideas are in your immediate social environment, and that and you mentioned that this peer pressure, susceptibility to peer pressure, this is one part of.
well, yeah. So when we looked at parental and peer pressure. The other thing that I didn't talk about that was also interesting about the peer pressure and the parental pressure stuff. It almost seemed, looking at the data, like it wasn't necessarily that parents were actually even necessarily giving or engaging in more pressure. It was very much a perception, right? We were asking them about their perceptions of it. But if you looked at if you asked them, a number of things about, parental behavior and peer behavior, and then looked at the sum scores, there was very little difference, despite them being different sources. So male peers, female peers, mom and dad, they saw them all as exerting the same high levels or the same low levels. And so again, it does make you wonder, again, about the kinds of things that create the susceptibility aspect, whether it's, again, just not having very accurate representations maybe of what's going on, and whether that makes them more likely to perceive everything in a negative way, that's shaping their behavior that way, or, as you said, in some cases making them more susceptible to things. It's not clear to me from the data which way it would be going, but I agree. There's certainly some indications that, especially for the adolescents anyways, that they're very susceptible to those kinds of ideas or memes. Yep.
So in thinking about the reproductive suppression sort of related to the other animal examples that you gave earlier on, so for this to be adaptive for the dominant individual to be suppressing the reproduction of the subordinate women, in this case, it may be adaptive to get them all the way to the point where they're no longer menstruating. The interim period, you're actually making them more attractive to mates, right? So if they're getting thinner,
well, only if they're already outside the range of what men consider attractive, right? Because men do consider a curvier figure.
but in general, I think this dieting competition thing is right. My friends are all losing weight and wearing a size 2, and so I want to do that too, and that is generally seen as more attractive. So
To women, though, but I agree. I think that's what's going on. That's something that's going on within women, anyways, that's driving that to that extent. I don't know. I mean, in terms of, you mean in terms of what the benefit, you mean that it's causing a cost to the dominants because somehow they're making the other women more attractive to men? I just don't think.
For it to be plausible, you'd have to have this really extreme, long-term extreme effect of the dominant on the other women.
Yeah,
And if they don't succeed, they may actually be increasing competition, not decreasing it.
That's true, although I'm still not convinced that that makes as big a difference in terms of the reality of the competition versus the perception of the competition. But I'm not sure that self-suppression versus, I mean, that debate over whether it's self-suppression or suppression by dominance, I think it's very unclear. If the model actually is correct and does work, which I'm not necessarily sure it does based on some of the data that we've got, whether it doesn't speak to whether it's self-suppression or suppression of dominance by suppression by dominance of subordinates. I think in the animal examples, there's a little bit better evidence for some of that. But again, there are also situations where it's very temporary often, right? It's like you want 1 or 2 breeding seasons because there's food resources are scarce, which is very different from the human situation where you're talking about longer time spans too. So it may be that it isn't relevant to our situation, even if the model is correct, which I'm not necessarily sure that it is. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering what it would look like if you more explicitly put cultural norms into this model.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, in a couple ways, I'm thinking one of them is something about your, maybe because slow in life history correlates with a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
So in evolutionary circles, we tend to use that as the thing as opposed to, well, I'm wealthy or I'm poor,
Sure.
or whatever, right? And, or that I come from some particular sector of society or another. If you looked at, those factors in terms of how likely you are to want to adopt a particular cultural ideal,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then something like willpower
Sure.
as, your ability to achieve a difficult cultural ideal, right? Because to be thin, you have to resist eating and all these things, right? So, I mean,
Sure.
I know there's a proximate ultimate issue and those things, but...
No, but those things are relevant because, especially like if we were collecting data in populations with different cultural norms than the one that we've been collecting it in, right? Then you would be able to address some of those issues. And I agree. I mean, I think we do need to do that. I mean, and I think that has been a larger problem with all of the research that's been done, which has been mostly in Western European countries and in the United States and Canada. And
it wouldn't
hasn't
be
been
difficult to, I mean, you've measured so many things, right? But I mean, it doesn't seem like, I don't know, I mean, you can't go back and do this with your data, but I mean, I think you could maybe reinterpret your data in light of something about internalization and ability to comply with cultural norms or desire to comply with cultural norms. But I think if in a future study, I mean, it seems like you can include instruments like how much do you endorse this ideal of beauty, and things like that, right? Not a whole lot harder to do than...
No, and I mean, we've already, set up things to control for all the things about social desirability too. And so I think incorporating something like that would be a good idea. So I agree. If we get ourselves sorted out to do another big chunk study, it would be a good way to approach that. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to like the degree to which anorexia and obsessive compulsive disorder are dissociable. Like how often do you get anorexia without the comorbid obsessive compulsion?
I am not a big enough specialist on the clinical literature to be able to do that, other than that I know that there's a lot of OCD that doesn't have anorexia associated with it, but I don't know enough about the clinical results to be able to give you a good number on that. I mean, I can tell you about anecdotal stuff from my school's counseling center, but not the statistics, but I'm pretty sure they are out there in that literature. Yeah.
They're comorbid, but they're not isomorphic.
Yeah.
Clearly.
Thinking about the reproductive suppression hypothesis, I'm not very familiar with the kinds of hormonal pathways that lead to amenorrhea, but considering like the costs of weight loss, and even if you don't need to be like abstinent and anorexic to develop amenorrhea, and if I guess if the ultimate goal is to suppress reproduction and in the face of like whatever sort of ecological conditions, is weight loss the only way to achieve that kind of biochemically? Because it seems like if you could do it more directly, then why bother with the whole weight loss thing?
Right. No, I agree that I think the question is there another way to do it that isn't as easily influenced by that? Now, certainly stress does, just generalized stress makes a difference to that. And, it's well known that when women are experiencing stress due to a variety of different things, missing 1 or 2 cycles is not unusual. And so it could be that specific, this part of it has not that clearly been worked out by the people who originally did some of the development of that model, in terms of what the specific hormonal influences are. So initially, a lot of the interest was in whether or not it was levels of estrogen that were influencing it, and that had a much clearer relationship to the amount of body fat that women have in terms of influencing that, shifting your body fat around shifts around your estrogen levels. And so that could be part of it, but there is also this issue about what's the role of stress hormones themselves. And it's not clear to me that anybody has done the hormonal work to actually demonstrate whether it's one or the other or neither. So, yeah.
On that same point, I was going to ask, do we know anything about the relationship between these kinds of eating disorders and attitudes towards condom use or abortion or, if the goal is reproductive suppression, there's lots of ways to do it. You might expect across the board reproductive suppression, more condoms, more abortions, or you might expect pick what you know works, and then, so that could be why the slow life history women have less of the eating disorders. They know how to use condoms. So
Well,
they don't have to worry with it.
right. I mean, they although, yes, in a sense, I mean, although obviously if the idea is that the mechanism developed in a world without them, then, it depends how much it's been shaped by the changes and how long.
Clark's culture question.
Yeah. But I don't actually know, and I think it's an interesting question that would be easy enough to test, whether or not you see this sort of effect. I mean, certainly some of the emotional intelligence and behavioral regulation stuff, I wouldn't be surprised if it was associated with just better use of modern birth control, because the thing is, we know that we have modern birth control, that we can influence all of this stuff in a very regulated way. Those of us who have not wanted to have children have not wanted to have children, because we've, managed to do that. But yet, a lot of people who at least claim they don't want to have children still somehow miraculously manage to use modern birth control in an effective way. So I think it's kind of an interesting question, but yeah, I'd love to see somebody else actually do that study, but I think it would be relevant. Yeah.
So let me propose an alternative hypothesis that maybe takes account of some of the concerns that Clark voiced, which are concerns that I share. And that's that there's an evolved mechanism that assesses own mate value relative to mate value of the global population. That mechanism operated in a world without movies and selfies and
plastic surgery.
And any mechanism can potentially break, right? For a variety of reasons. And that body dysmorphic disorder is what happens when that self-assessment component that focuses on the body as opposed to social skills, human capital, intelligence, all the other things that might matter. Right? When that part of that mechanism is broken, people inaccurately assess their own bodily attractiveness. In a culture in which there's a female ideal of thinness that manifests as pathological weight reduction for women, right? But you have, for example, a high rate of body dysmorphic disorder in male bodybuilders, right? Who, they seem to inaccurately perceive where they are in the actual distribution in the population.
Yeah, it's more like the flip of the same coin in that sense, yeah.
And you mentioned plastic surgery. I mean, body dysmorphic disorder is a big problem in plastic surgery that involves both, subcranial modification and facial modification. You're in Palm Springs, we're in West Los Angeles.
Yes.
You don't have to go very far to see people who, just glancing at them, you think, either that person was in some kind of horrible accident, or they've got some kind of psychopathology that is shaping their use of plastic surgery, right?
Sure.
Some of those attributes, what constitutes an attractive face are governed by universal features of evolved psychology. Many of them are, parochial cultural norms. And so if there's, a self-mate value assessment mechanism that includes within it a component of physical attractiveness, then whatever the local norms are, if that's broken, people will, be pathological in their behavior. So if you have a preference for, heavier body weight, right?
You should
then
see
you'll
the-
get people, some fraction of the population
Right.
will be, exceeding the cultural ideal pathologically, right?
Right.
If people prefer large breasts or large buttocks or, whatever it is, right? Small feet, turns out,
Sure.
right? That those are all things that people will have plastic surgery to modify.
Right. So in a sense, it could be that that's what's driving it, and that if that is what's driving it, then you should be able to go to places where the standards are different, and it should fit that, right? You should see thinner in this, heavier in this, in terms of the disordered aspects of things, and maybe even in terms of some of the other modifications. Although I guess the other thing would be to retract some of the weird individual differences, because I'm thinking of some of the really crazy plastic surgery stuff that you see, where it's like somebody looks like a cat by the time it's done, like their eyes are all messed up and stuff like that. There's some extra stuff going on maybe in their cases.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
it suggests that you should expect across the board problems, right? So the same person who suffers from restrictive anorexia nervosa may think that her ears are too big, and her teeth are not white enough, or whatever it is, right? That the problems are with self-perception of physical attractiveness, right? Relative to
Right.
what the local cultural norm
Right.
is.
Well, and that would actually be a useful thing to test that most of the studies haven't tested, right? Is to see how broad the dissatisfaction actually is. Because most of it does just focus on the weight, because that's what seems most pathological to the people looking at it, as opposed to some of the other things that people might do. So I agree, that would be a good way to look at it.
I mean, I've never spoken directly to a plastic surgeon, but my understanding is that they screen people for these
They
disorders
do.
because they get so
Yeah.
many of them, right?
Yeah, they do. Yeah. And, I mean, some of them screen for it and some of them don't, but the ones that are reputable screen for it because they don't want to deal with somebody who's going to come back and come back and come back and come back, trying to make themselves look like a Barbie doll or whatever. I agree. All right, thank you.